All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of my never-ending quest to try to make things easier for students in the AWD-1000 Web Development Technologies and the AWD-1111 Database-Driven Websites courses, I'm trying to create a bunch of video presentations based on the ebooks by Mr. Flavio Copes. And so far, I have come through and done his entire HTML handbook. Boom, it's gone. His entire CSS handbook. Boom, that's gone. That brings me up to the JavaScript Beginner's Handbook. A little shorter than the one I just did. In fact, about half the size. Okay, so just to start on it, I like the subject of history, but that said, I'm not going to spend much time going over the history of JavaScript. All right, so I'm just going to jump into the stuff right away. So we'll get into the syntax, the use of semicolons, values, variables, types, expressions, operators, precedents, comparisons, conditional, strings, arrays, loops, functions. That's pretty much the standard stuff. Then after that, we got to get into the stuff that's specific to JavaScript and probably the more complex stuff, that being arrow functions, objects, object properties and methods, classes, inheritance, asynchronous programming, promises, async and await, and variable scope. All right, so as we get started, as it says, this handbook follows the 80-20 rule. You learn in 20% of the time, 80% of a topic. I'm not even sure if that's correct. All right. But I do know that going over the stuff that previously from the other two handbooks, that Mr. Copes does a nice job. All right, I'll just leave it right there. The book does not try to cover everything under the sun related to JavaScript. Rather, it focuses on the core of the language, trying to simplify more complex topics. All right. So, JavaScript is probably the most popular programming language in the world. If it's not, it's definitely in the group photo. It's a great language for your first programming language, yet it's not. It is because it's very forgiving. It's not because, since it is very forgiving, sometimes at least you can develop bad habits that you try to bring across to other languages that are not as forgiving. Mainly, you use JavaScript to create websites, web apps, and server-side applications. Now, this is not discussed in this one at all. All right. In fact, Mr. Copes has got an entire thing that's on Node and all of its related stuff. So JavaScript is not related to these things. It can be used for all sorts of stuff. I'm not going to sit and read to you. You can basically use it to program just about anything. In fact, today, it's not very hard to go and take JavaScript and use it maybe in accordance with some other software to go in and program even things like Android apps and iPhone apps. All right. So JavaScript is a programming language that is, number one, high level. It provides abstractions that allow you to ignore details of the machine you're running on. So it does a lot of stuff in the background. And there are a lot of things that are done for you. In addition, as I mentioned before, with JavaScript being a good first language to learn and bad first language to learn, a lot of times if you forget to do something, JavaScript guesses what you want and almost always guesses correctly, and it does it for you. It's a dynamic programming language. All right. As it says, it executes at runtime many of the things that other languages do at compile time. What does that mean? That means that it's late binded. What does that mean? That means that there's a lot of stuff you can do as the program is running that you can't always do in other languages. What do I mean? For example, while your program is running, you can add things to an array. You can make it bigger. You cannot do that in a language like C, Java, C Sharp, etc. Okay? All right. Dynamically typed. JavaScript variables do not enforce a type. You can create, for example, you can create a JavaScript variable that you assign the number 15 to it. Then later on in your program, you can take that same variable and assign the value true to it. Then later you can take the same variable and assign a string to it, like hello or something like that. Okay? And this all goes along with the fact that, as it says here up on top of the page, it is a loosely typed programming language. It does not enforce the type that you give a variable. All right? It says it allows it more flexibility. But some other languages also provide things that JavaScript does not provide. It's interpreted. It means it does not need to go through a compilation stage before a program is run. That's the good news. The bad news is when it finds an error, if it considers it to be a bad enough error, the program just stops until you fix that error. All right, it's multi-paradigm. As it says, the language does not enforce any particular programming paradigm. All right, it says, for example, unlike Java, which is object-oriented, really, JavaScript, in that sense, I call it object-based. What that means is JavaScript allows you to use object-oriented programming principles, or OOP principles. It allows you to use them, and actually in different ways, but it does not force you to use them like other languages do. All right, again, JavaScript is not Java. Okay, fine. So the history, notice, created in 1995. So we're talking about a language that's a quarter of a century old. All right, it is 26 years old. All right, sorry, let the clock stop chiming. It says it was the first scripting language that was widely supported natively by web browsers. In fact, it's built in virtually to every browser. All right. In the beginnings, JavaScript was not nearly as powerful as it was today. Now, not only that, for the longest time, when you ask someone what JavaScript was, it was a language that was for the client side. But today it can be used both on the client side and on the server side. All right. With the growing needs of the web, they demanded that JavaScript had to grow as well, and it has. It's now widely used outside of the browser. Again, Node.js is an example, and there's other examples as well. Sometimes it says it's hard to separate JavaScript from the features of the environment that it's used in. For example, console.log says you can find in many code examples is not JavaScript. Rather, it's part of a library of APIs or application program interfaces provided by the browser. All right. In this book, Mr. Copes talks about JavaScript language. So let's jump into syntax, and you'll notice there's 5 parts in here: white space, case sensitivity, literals, identifiers, and comments. JavaScript does not consider white space to be meaningful. So normally, you can, if you want to pretty things up by lining up the equal sign where you've got your variables defined, etc., you can do that. The only time where white space does matter is you cannot break a string, which is a series of characters enclosed inside of either single quotes or double quotes. You can't break that up over 2 lines. One of the key things in here is, like most programming languages, JavaScript is case sensitive. So not only, as it says, when you create a variable that's called something, not only something all lowercase would be different than something with a capital S, all right, anything that you create, any identifier that you create is case sensitive, and the built-in JavaScript methods, functions, etc. that allow you to do things, they're also case sensitive. All right. All right. Literals. We define as literal a value that is written in source code. So for instance, any of these things that you see right here, these are all literals. I look at it this way. If it can appear on the right-hand side of an equal sign, at least there's a good chance it's a literal if it isn't a literal. All right. Identifiers, those are things you create. You create variables, you create functions, you create methods, you create class names, you create array names, you create object names, etc. Those are all things that you create. Now, you can read their rules here. I'll just tell you that if you stick to naming everything and you use only letters, you're best off. All right, I would not recommend doing this, even this, or this. All right. Some names, as it says, are reserved for JavaScript internal use. I think there's about 60 to 65 keywords in JavaScript. They'll probably be shown in here. All right. Comments, you can create comments in two ways in JavaScript. This is a single line comment. So if you put 2 forward slashes on a line, then everything from that point on to the right automatically becomes a comment, so it's ignored by the interpreter. If you want to comment, if you want to go and create a comment that's multi-line, it starts with /*, that's forward slash asterisk, and it ends with */. That's asterisk forward slash. And this can be as many lines long as you want it or need it to be. Semicolons, now, I don't at all disagree here with Mr. Copes when he says that every line in a JavaScript program is optionally terminated by semicolons. I said optionally because the JavaScript interpreter is smart enough that if you don't put it in, it basically puts an implied semicolon in for you. Now, he says in here, my personal preference is to always avoid semicolons unless strictly necessary. My own personal preference is the opposite of that. And the reason for that, the reason that I say put them in, as opposed to, for example, what Mr. Cope says, is we teach really 3 different programming languages in Rankin Technical College. In the first semester, you learn JavaScript. In the second semester, you learn C#. In the third semester, you keep working with JavaScript using Node.js. And in the fourth semester, you work with Java and Android programming, writing Android programs with Java. The reason I'm telling you that is C# and Java all require that you have semicolons at the end of your lines. So it's much easier to keep doing it if you're already used to doing it. Okay. All right, values. It says the type is the kind of value, its category. When we need to reference a value, we assign it to a variable. So a variable, my own take, my own definition on what is a variable is it's a named memory location. So it's someplace inside of computer memory that's got a name and that can change. So its value can change or vary as the program runs. All right. So again, they mentioned that JavaScript is loosely typed. That's true. So I can create a variable. I can say, for example, just to quickly show you this, let's see. So I can come in here and I can say, make it a little bigger. I can say let age equal 21. And then I probably wouldn't do this, but if I needed to later on in the program, I could say age equal you did not enter a viable age. And then if I wanted to, even later in the program, I could say age equal true. Those are 3 different variable types. The first one is a numeric variable. The second one is a string variable. The third one is a Boolean variable. But I'm assigning 3 different variable types to the same variable. And you can do that because JavaScript is a loosely typed language. You cannot do that in a language like C# or Java. All right, but you can in JavaScript because, again, it's loosely typed. Now, you can create variables in 2 main ways. Here's the first way. Here's the second way. So what's the difference? When you define a variable like this, const a equals 0, and you define a simple variable like that, that variable's value cannot change while the program's running. It's a constant. That's what const is short for. On the other hand, when you do this, this is a true variable. So as it says, const defines a constant reference to a value, meaning it cannot be changed. You cannot reassign a new value to it. But with let, you can. So you can't do this, but you can do this. Now, const in JavaScript isn't as particular as const is in other languages. All right? And the only way you're going to understand that is to see some examples. All right? And don't worry about it, because it'll make more and more sense as we go on. At least I believe it will. When you create a const, you must give it a value right away. You can't say const a, semicolon, or just const a. You've got to give it a value. This part that you see right here, that's called the variable declaration. This is a variable declaration. This is a variable initialization, as is this. So with let, you can do this over 2 lines. With const, you cannot do it over 2 lines. All right, you can declare multiple variables at once in the same statement, and a lot of authors will tell you you should do that. I don't. I recommend you not doing it. All right. You cannot redeclare the same variable. So I can say let a equal 1, and on the next line I can say a equal 2, but I can't say let, and on the next line use let with the same variable again. As it says, if you try to do that, you'll get a duplicate declaration error. So the author says, my advice is to always use const and only use let when you know you'll need to reassign. Why? Because it says the less power the code has, the better. If you know a value can't be reassigned, all right, make it a const, because you'll probably end up with less bugs. I don't disagree with that at all. Now, they also talk about var in here. As it says, until 2015, so until about 6 years ago, var was the only way you declared variables. All right. Today, var has basically been replaced with const and let. Var is a very poor way to declare variables. And it's a very poor way to declare variables because it can let you do some things you really shouldn't do. All right. It says there are fundamental differences. If you want, you can look at the post that's here. And this is actually his post. All right, where he talks about the differences between let and var. But I wouldn't do it. Just use const and let and you're best off. All right, let's just go on for a little bit more. It says variables in JavaScript do not have to have any type attached. They are untyped. Once you assign a value to a variable, you can later reassign it to another type. We have already seen that. JavaScript has 2 main types of variables, primitive types and object types. There are, actually, I think there's a couple more than this. I think undefined is considered, well, these are special. Okay, all right. Numbers, a number variable type is any kind of number, whether it's a whole number, also known as an integer, or whether it's a number that has a decimal in it. All right, all those are all numbers. Strings are collections of characters that are either between single quotes, all right, or double quotes. Booleans are true-false values. Symbols are something fairly new in JavaScript. I'm going to put that off and we'll let him talk about it in a little bit. Null means unknown. So if you're a brand new student at Rankin Technical College and I say to you, what's your grade point average, Bob? And Bob says, I don't know, I just started. I guess it's 0. No, it's not. 0 implies that you took a class and failed it. But if you don't have anything yet, your grade point average is null, meaning it's unknown. For undefined, remember up here we looked at this. Let me move back up here a little bit. There. Right there, not this line. Pretend this line isn't there. If I just say let a, then the value of A is undefined. So if I try to print it before I've given it a value, that's what it'll say, is undefined. All right. There's also object types. An object is not a simple or a primitive variable like the ones we looked at above. All right. Objects have what are called properties and methods. So imagine that, for example, a human object. What are properties that we have? We have an eye color. We have a hair color. We have a gender. We have a height. We have a weight. Those are 5 properties right there. We also have methods. We eat. We drink. We sleep. Okay? As it says, we'll talk more about objects as we go on in here. Expressions. An expression is a single unit of JavaScript code that it can evaluate. Typically, there's examples right here, but usually you talk about arithmetic expressions. As it says, typically they take a variable and an operator and they figure out something based on it. All right. And there'll be more on this later. Let's stop right here before we get into operators, and we'll pick that up in the next lesson.